Good evening and welcome to this special Melbourne Symphony Orchestra Ears Wide Open event. My name is James Scullen and I'm the Director of Programs at the Asia Society, Australia's leading global think tank dedicated to Asia. We connect business, policy and the arts, helping Australians to understand and engage with Asia and our region. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're streaming from today, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, that piece of music you heard was just a teaser of a collaboration between the Melbourne and Singapore Symphony Orchestras performing a virtual side-by-side performance of Bach's joyous double symphony in E-flat major, one of only 3 symphonies that he scored for 2 orchestras. The performance features Brett Kelly conducting MSO and Joshua Tan conducting the SSO, evidence that while the pandemic may have brought us considerable hardship, through soft diplomacy and technology, we've been able to witness new breakthroughs in artistic collaboration. It also showcases the strong cultural ties between Australia and Singapore, which is just one example of the way that orchestras and the arts can meaningfully contribute in this sphere. The full performance of that MSO-SSO collaboration will be released on YouTube this Friday evening. Tonight's event is part of MSO's Ears Wide Open series. Each of these events are designed to give you the opportunity to discover more about the MSO's music from the world-class artists, producers and composers working on stage and behind the scenes at the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. Sadly, we can't be joining you as usual from the Iwaki Theatre this evening, but we're thrilled to have so many of you joining us online from your own homes. Thank you to our Ears Wide Open presenting partner, Tarawara Estate, and to the City of Melbourne for their support of Ears Wide Open. Thank you also to the Australian Government through the Office of the Arts and the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations for their support of this event. Now, tonight we're exploring the power of art in its ability to forge immediate links between countries. At the Asia Society, we understand the utility of arts in forging relationships and providing context to Australia's role in a culturally diverse and rapidly evolving region. And we enjoy our partnership with the MSO and other cultural institutions from around the country. Tonight, we are asking the question, what role does the 21st century orchestra and the arts more broadly have to play in fostering international relations? And our panel of experts will delve deep into the importance of soft diplomacy and the role that artists can play in building international relationships. This far-reaching discussion will explore who is leading the soft power agenda and where the future of international creative diplomacy initiatives is headed. So without any further ado, let's meet our guests for this evening. Chung Hak Peng is the Chief Executive Officer of Singapore Symphony Group. Dr. Pippa Dixon is the Director at AsiaLink Arts. Andrew Cumston is the Director for the Victorian State Office of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Li Wei Chin is a world-renowned cellist and chamber musician and Associate Professor at Yong Seo To Conservatory of Music. And a face familiar to many on today's call, Dr. Sophie Gallais, the Managing Director of the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. We're eager to hear how each of these speakers utilises the power of creative international collaborations, examples of the way they've collaborated with international organisations and individuals, and how this has impacted the relationship between countries. Now, tonight, we're also keen to hear from you in the audience. So if you have a question at any time throughout the proceedings, please enter it in the YouTube comment box, and we'll get to as many of those questions towards the end of the session. Now, let's start by discussing the importance of soft diplomacy and the role that arts and artists can play in building international relationships. When we talk about soft diplomacy, we may also use the terms cultural diplomacy, soft power, or simply engagement. A definition that strikes a chord with me is that soft diplomacy is a means for government and non-state actors to provide a full account of who we are as Australians on the international stage. So I'd like to kick off by hearing more about our speakers and what each of their organisations are doing in the space of cultural diplomacy. So Pippa Dixon, I'd love to hear from you and more about AsiaLink Arts and its relationship with cultural diplomacy.
Thanks, James, and thanks so much for having me, everybody. What a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I think firstly, it's really important to acknowledge identity in place as well, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining from the country of the Whadjuk, and Noongar peoples today, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders. And I also acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Boon Wurrung peoples in Naarm, where the University of Melbourne and AsiaLink is located. Further to that, all Indigenous and First Nations people across the Indo-Pacific on whose land we work. So thanks, James. We've been working in cultural diplomacy and what we call arts-based diplomacy at AsiaLink Arts for 31 years this year, and we have an alumni of over 1,000 artists and arts workers across the country and across all art forms. That has traditionally taken up a space of residencies, outbound residencies across the region. But more and more, we've been focusing in the last couple of years on two-way and reciprocal exchanges, which we call art-based diplomacy, plus thought leadership work, so forums, conferences and symposiums, and advocacy for elevating and increasing investment in arts and cultural work throughout the region and that international engagement. So AsiaLink actually has 4 program areas, and we believe in the sort of cross-sectoral nature of all the work we do across arts, diplomacy, business, and education, and we collaborate closely together to enable cross-sectoral conversations.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pippa. Li Wei, you're joining us today as a musician and also from the Yong Seo To Conservatory of Music. How does cultural diplomacy affect your line of work?
Hi, James. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation to be speaking with my esteemed colleagues. Because of my background, I was born in China, grew up in Australia, lived in England, and now living in Singapore. I guess often in my touring career, every year, I get the opportunity to, I suppose, wear many different national hats. So every year, there are opportunities working with, for example, the Singapore Symphony, where in fact, because of COVID, we couldn't do it, but there was a wonderful project we were going to do actually do 2 concertos, one with a Chinese concerto with pipa and cello with orchestra, and together with, of course, Strauss Don Quixote. And with the Melbourne Symphony, often I get to play, and 2016 we had the opportunity to tour in China. And with some Chinese orchestra, we get to go to different countries in Europe, promoting, of course, sometimes the One Belt, One Road initiative in Europe. But I think for me, the most important thing is actually to recognize that in every different area, in every different country, there are so many different perspectives and tastes and musical understandings. We might be playing the same piece, but the perspectives and their understanding are quite different. But it actually make our profession much more interesting and rewarding, I suppose, in connecting, in achieving the connection using this medium, music or culture, and to understand their perspectives and their background in doing so. So I suppose my life is always dealing with different countries and different flights.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you for that, Li Wei. Andrew, you're joining us today from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. How does culture play into the profile of foreign affairs and trade?
Well, thank you, James, and I'd also thank you for joining me, allowing me to join such an august panel. And also, I'd like to support your acknowledgement of country. I guess the first way to answer this question is a little bit about why we do it. And it's embedded across our department that one of our key mission statements, as outlined in our white paper, is that part of our role is to promote Australia as open, vibrant, prosperous, contemporary and democratic. And the arts are such a good symbol of Australia and representing us for all our diversity and our openness. And the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, for example, is just an amazing institution. It opened doors all over the world. Had a fantastic tour to the United States last year, which I know I was in a room between a couple of ministers, and the meeting was frankly just going along okay. And once they started talking about the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra, they opened up, and suddenly rapport was established. And then other things could be talked about. But so the arts has that convening power, but it also, speaking very frankly, we're very well aware the arts is a $100 billion a year industry in Australia, and part of our job is promoting Australian people, Australian livelihoods, and we try to convene and leverage Australian arts, both for the image of Australia, but also for the good of the art sector in Australia, because the cultural sector in Australia is incredibly important to our overall economy and the Australian people. And the question of how we do that, well, there's sort of a million answers to that. Well, of course, there's the direct cultural grants and the various work we do in Australia as through the China Foundation, which is not directly part of DFAT, but is sort of part of the broader government foreign affairs effort, while still arm's length. There's supporting this event tonight, but of almost all our large posts maintain large cultural diplomacy teams. We have modest cultural diplomacy budgets, which I can tell you from personal experience, we agonize over spending every dollar in the best way we can. But it's something that we embrace with a passion, because we know how important it is to our overall image, Australia's image in foreign countries. And just briefly, Australia on soft power indexes is rated 10th in the world, which, if you think on a population, on an economy basis, is one of our very strongest metrics of our ability to reach overseas. So it is something that we promote both for its own sake and because it has an incredibly beneficial multiplier power to Australia's image. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to hear about the power of the MSO at the diplomatic table. Now, that also segues very nicely to hearing from Sophie and Huck. Sophie and Huck, I'd love to hear about the MSO and SSO more broadly, but I'm sure our audience is also keen to learn more about the virtual collaboration between the MSO and SSO. Particularly from an operational perspective, what was it like bringing together the two orchestras to collaborate virtually? Sophie, I'll go to you first.
Well, thank you, James. If you allow me, I would like to acknowledge that I stand on the land of the Kulin Nation and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and future. As I'm sure Huck is acknowledging, he's standing on Singaporean ground. We at the MSO have been touring with the oldest Australian orchestra, and I've been touring since 1965, and I've done for 4 decades, tour very regularly that were done in one way, where we would come to a country and perform concerts. In the last 6-7 years, and Huck Peng has been a participant in this, we have actually increased our collaboration internationally and found amazing partners in China and Singapore and Indonesia. So sorry for the end bracket telling our story. I remember meeting Huck Peng in China for the first time, and then having a coffee with him in Adelaide a year later or so, and discussing how we could collaborate. And at that point, 3 or 4 years ago, we were thinking of exchanging musicians, co-commissioning, but really in a traditional way. And then last year, the pandemic was a pain for everyone, but at the same time, actually an amazing opportunity to review how we could work together and keep going and maintain that friendship and maintain this engagement. And that's how we decided to go into the trying to figure out how to do this project, this collaboration.
And Huck, what was that like from your end at the SSO?
I thought that it was an extremely exciting opportunity. I will pick up from where Sophie spoke about, and in the middle of the pandemic last year, we were thinking about this collaboration that we wanted to have, and it was not possible to do any kind of traveling. So the idea came to do something digitally, because we were both working through that within our own orchestras and slowly figuring out how to deliver our music to the local audience. And so it was a natural extension. I thought that this was quite a significant decision that both orchestras made, because it was a period where financials were very uncertain. And so the natural tendency was to see what kind of costs we could cut and what kind of programs we would cut. And the fact that we did decide to proceed with this is a reflection of how important we felt it was to maintain the relationships and the collaborations between borders, particularly in a time where isolation seemed to be the main theme of the day. And we thought that we should not isolate and we should reach out across the seas and across the oceans in order to continue some form of collaboration where we could.
Fantastic. And Huck, I understand that SSO is very active when it comes to the exchange of musicians, namely with orchestras from Shanghai, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. I'd like you to give us some understanding about what cultural learnings take place when an orchestra receives a visiting musician, and also conversely, how that time spent in another orchestra can benefit a musician's career and more generally their cultural understanding of another region more generally.
That's a really broad-ranging question. I think the short answer is that even if the monolith of an orchestra appears the same everywhere, I think that culturally, both organizational culture as well as the culture of the land that we are in and the society that we're in impact small things such as how people work together, how people make music together, the sequences and processes, the feeling and the beat and the pulse and how you do that and how do you interact with one conductor versus another. So I think for the individual musician, it is quite an enriching experience just because if you've been performing with the same 90 musicians in an orchestra, going to a different one gives you suddenly a fresh breath of air, allowing you to think about music, perhaps the same piece of music, perhaps a different piece of music, but think about it in a different way and to feel it in a different way. And I think that is also useful in this idea of cross-cultural understanding because there will definitely be interactions that you will have with musicians of the hosting orchestra as well. And the hosting orchestra also gets to learn and to see new things and hear different perspectives.
Great. Pippa and Li Wei, I might ask you a similar question. What has the impact of COVID been for soft diplomacy? Have our closed borders only prevented our avenues for cultural collaboration, or has the digital space adequately been able to fill the soft diplomacy gap? Pippa, I might go to you first.
Thanks, James. I think it's a really interesting question and sort of really obvious at the moment because we're all having to transform the way we work. It's come out at a really interesting time, hasn't it? Because it was already, a colder diplomatic era with some particular relations with China as well, and then COVID hit. So I think both of those things combined, in particular with our work, has meant that, one, we're more motivated than ever to achieve positive outcomes with arts-based diplomacy. And secondly, then forced into a new paradigm and realm of working and really needing to invest in experimentation and piloting. We recently delivered a project thanks to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Australian Cultural Diplomacy Grant Program, which Andrew was just referencing is very competitive. So we're thrilled to receive that support for a program called Sonic Bridge. And it was a contemporary music exchange. It was meant to be a physical, a mobile project where there were events and performances in each place. But of course, we couldn't do any of that. And then it wasn't just a matter of everyone experiencing COVID at the same time. There was significant lag to what we were experiencing in Australia to China. So we were thinking about what sorts of performances that might take place simultaneously. And of course, we just couldn't do it. So we've looked at a whole lot of new modalities to express the relationships and actually forge and develop strong people-to-people ties. And that takes time. And immersion is such an important part of it usually, right? If it's contemporary music, you want to be in a live, sweaty venue. You want to have the endorphins and the pheromones of being there and feeling the vibration of the beat, etc. There's so much involved in it. So really we couldn't replicate or duplicate that sense. But what we could do is really foster a fertile ground for the creatives, the artists involved, plus filmmakers, to really get to know each other. So we had to use what are fairly now basic platforms to do that, but nurturing the relationships and the people so that they felt supported. Our goal is always to enable autonomous relationships and autonomous connections to take place. So we basically open doors and create a space for connection to guide and develop the relationship. And then hopefully success looks like those individuals who are involved furthering their connection autonomously, as I mentioned, but more than that, the community feeling an impact around them. So those insights and connections being shared beyond those to reciprocal relationships. So look, it's been very, very challenging with COVID, but what a gift as well, because I think that, you know, much of what we're doing now is going to sustain beyond the pandemic. I think we're all wondering when that might be at the moment, but you know, we're going to have to think of new ways of working. We want to think about our environmental impacts with travel and engaging face-to-face. But we still don't want to ignore that. We have to invest in the immersive qualities, particularly with new relationships. I think when we have existing ties to people, place and communities, it's a little bit easier. But I'm excited about the possibilities of the digital realm thanks to COVID and how much that's accelerated our capability.
Great. Well, what about you, Li Wei? In your capacity as a musician and also as professor at the Yongzhou To Conservatory, has COVID brought some unexpected positive outcomes for yourself?
Funny you say that, because literally today, I got an email from our conservatory because I think Singapore is in a kind of semi-lockdown. So we are encouraged to teach our students online. Of course, it's been a difficult time, especially for performers and artists. And you know, our life is on delivering and bring our music to the audience, and it hasn't been easy, I must be honest. But at the same time, like Pippa said, I think we have to look at the brighter side. There's also always a silver lining, I suppose. I mean, you know, when I'm teaching my students, often I will actually encourage them not to always to have the instrument in their hands. Actually take their time and to think about what you do. And this pandemic has, brought us this time. You know, before this Melbourne trip, I haven't traveled for more than 15 months. And I was in Singapore and I had the time to think about and to focus and also to investigate what is the real meaning behind what we do. Often as a touring performer, you know, you're playing concerts every week and you stop thinking about things like this. And because it becomes a job, of course, you might be very good at it and you become a professional, but to have that, yes, unwanted, but quite needed time to think about what you do. And I think it's a great thing. And because of the technology, I had the opportunity to collaborate with both Australia and China on a very frequent basis. Last year I did it, you know, the conductor, you heard the piece with Brett Kelly. He runs the Melbourne Youth Orchestra. So I did a kind of webinar with many of the students, young musicians, online, and talk about, you know, the professional musical life and just to give them a little insight of what the real professional musician life is like. And we got we had a very big digital crowd listening and discussing ideas. It was great. And in China, of course, you know, they're also reaching out to musicians because I can't, as an Australian, I can't really actually enter China so easily now. And so a lot of the Chinese orchestras and musicians are reaching out and see if I could do digital collaborations. And it's been very, very adventurous, you know, things that we thought was never possible. Even often, actually, if you ask me the same question in 2018, I'll probably say I would not want to do it because you think it's undermining the real essence of performing art. But having tried it, it's not too bad. And you know, technology has given us this opportunity to explore, to be adventurous and be innovative, and both in teaching and in performing. So I'm grateful. But having said that, like everybody on this panel, I think we are all very much looking forward to the new norm where we could still meet our audiences and to let them feel the impact of real performance live.
No doubt. Well, thank you, Li Wei, and I really love that notion of using the pandemic to reflect and take time to pause. To our audience, don't forget you can ask any of the panel a question. To do so, please type that question into the YouTube comment box. Andrew Cumston, as our resident diplomat on the panel this evening, how important is government policy in nurturing soft diplomacy between two nations? And to what degree is government support needed for our arts to flourish?
Well, that's a $1 million question, James, about what's the appropriate level of government support. I would just pick up on something Pippa said, which I really liked, about the endorphins of a live event. And I completely agree. And I'll never have the experience that some people on this panel have of entertaining a crowd of 3,000 people with an artistic event. But I do know the excitement of finding a key contact at intermission of a cultural event and being able to conduct some diplomacy or at least establish rapport. So we're all looking forward we're all doing our best under COVID restrictions, but we're all looking forward to the thrill of live events and people mingling together and the opportunities and the enjoyment that creates. So what's an appropriate level of government support? I guess we're all under pressure to justify the support that we do get, and at DFAT, what we do is we try to look at some of the macro level analysis of the benefit we get from these activities, but also each individual post in our missions across the world. As I mentioned, those cultural diplomacy grants, they're very hotly contested, and we have to look very closely at the benefit they give and also the time that we put into them, because it's not always, sometimes it's what we'll often do is we'll make our dollar value go farther by using our missions around the world. We have some beautiful real estate which we try to leverage for the benefit of the Australian people as much as possible, for instance, in places like Paris and Washington. So the appropriate level is not the right question to ask an official. The right question to ask an official is, how can you use what you have in the best way we can? And a lot of thought does go into that, and we're very much keen. We like to leverage, and we look at the same metrics that all artistic venues do. We look at the engagement, we look at the way the feedback, we look at eyeballs on our social media. And look, I will be perfectly honest that sometimes there is real value, something for them like the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. Partly it's the audience it reaches to. It does reach a certain type of audience, which is often very, very valuable to reach. So we look at all those kind of things when we're considering how and what to support with the arts. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you, Andrew. Pippa, coming back to you, as a tool that's utilised on the diplomatic stage, what role does cultural diplomacy play when relations between nations are frayed? So I'm thinking of the current status of the Australia-China relationship. And I'd like to hear more about your Sonic Bridge project that was a collaboration between artists from Australia and China.
Yeah, actually, we were very bold with that project, and it was a collaboration between Australian artists, contemporary musicians, and an electronic music artist from Wuhan in China. And when we first announced that late last year, there were audible gasps from Australian audiences and supporters who thought, wow, at the time, particularly given the narratives globally, that was a particularly interesting choice, but important to us. Very important to us, actually, to move beyond what are, negative perceptions of place and peoples, and really sort of tap into the humanity of the situation or the environment. And I think that's what arts and culture really does. It reminds us of our interconnectedness, and a pandemic, more than any other scenario, is a really important time to do that. I think we are. I think probably all sick of hearing that we're in this together, but we really are. And I think cultural diplomacy manages to weave its way through and create a thread of global connectivity and understanding between peoples. that you can't necessarily do with big trade. And I also thank Andrew for mentioning the importance of the creative industries in trade. Every artist, I like to say, is a business. Some of them are small and some of them are large, but they are businesses. So, you can get through some of the hurdles and hoops that there might be and the barriers that there might be to other industries. The people-to-people links are enduring, and they've been there through all time, really, and it's something that we can sort of really tap into. And I think those iterative engagements, connecting with existing networks and trying to expand out in times like this is critical, and reminding, I think, all of us that we are connected, and it's incredibly valuable to continue these connections right now. So Sonic Bridge was a really great example. There were a lot of learnings, so there's a lot of capability development that can happen, skill sharings and new insights along the way as well, but just a deepening friendship across Australia and China with that project that was able to be shared much more broadly because of COVID through the digital platforms and through the filmmaking. So often when we might do live engagements, you do have impact with various audiences, but with the digital, it can be a lot bigger and enduring as well. These things have a footprint, right, that lasts for a very long time. So, I'm excited about what we can do in this period. I would say, though, to Andrew's point, we can never have enough government support for these types of programs. I would love to see the investment by the Australian government quadrupled, tenfold, really, at the moment, especially in this time. I think there would be no better investment. We all hear about the investment in defence, in hard power. We could just increase the soft power investment a little bit at the moment and have an enormous impact for Australians to develop, a shared and prosperous future, for all of us.
Thank you, Pippa. Now, we're all familiar with a lot of the stereotypes of Australia that permeate our image respective to other nations. Australia is a sparse country of beaches with a pure environment, food that is clean and green, full of dangerous animals. I did some cursory research, and that 21 of the top 25 dangerous snakes are from Australia. So that frightening statistic shows that perhaps that stereotype is well-founded. Li Wei, I wanted to ask you about Australia's image overseas. You migrated to Australia when you were 13. I'm curious, what impressions did you have, if you can remember, of the country prior to moving? And what do you think a young person in China of a similar age would think of Australia today? And do you think that perception of Australia has perhaps shifted since you were 13 and you moved to Australia?
It has certainly shifted, in my opinion. You have to remember, what you probably don't know, I actually arrived in Tasmania first. So there I was, a 13-year-old boy, close my eyes. My mom said, "You're coming to Australia." Yeah, I close my eyes, I think the West. I see images of Manhattan. And there I was, landed in Hobart. There was not even a luggage belt. The luggage came out on the little trolley, and so it was quite a culture shock. And I went to the Taruna High School. I was the only Asian there. It was interesting and tough at the same time. But luckily, I had music, so being an international language, it was very useful for me to break ice. But Australia now is so much more open now, and it's much greater diversity and I suppose inclusiveness, and often much more adventurous. Not unlike our cuisine. I mean, if you look at Australian cuisine now compared to, let's say, 20 years ago, it's quite a different affair. And I think culturally there's that element too, because we have so many people coming to Australia, and then it's quite a melting pot. And so I suppose the image of Australia internationally, if let's say in China, people think of it as a still relatively young country, but with a lot of different colors, different cultural influences. And I think I feel very proud to be an Australian in that way, because I think, this Australia is always open, and it's always open to ideas, and is always open to excellence. And it's a fantastic place to be right now. And I think it's every Australian's responsibility to preserve this quality for the times to come.
And so, Li Wei, if I can stick with you, what do you think an international audience can learn about the country after seeing an Australian musical performance, such as an orchestra or symphony?
One of my most proudest moments was actually 2016 when we toured, MSO and myself, we toured in China. And the first concert, of course, I did the Saint-Saëns concerto. It was okay. But the second concert, we did the Beethoven triple concerto. And we had an Australian violinist and me being the cellist and the Chinese pianist with an Australian orchestra, a British conductor, and been witnessed and listened to by, thousands of Chinese audience. And, I felt so proud because I felt, the gaps. We were playing a very important role in bridging the gaps, and I suppose Australian culture institutions are viewed as a very wonderful platform for different culture to be melted into one. So that was a pinnacle of my, if you like, culture ambassador work.
Huck, if I can ask you for a more objective response, that you're situated in Singapore, to you, what are the hallmarks of Australian art, particularly around classical music?
So I think the familiarity that people have here with Australia does in fact start with music. And last year when we were collaborating, there were many tunes that people in Singapore could recognize immediately, and they weren't sung in the video. They were performed by the wonderful MSO in collaboration with us. And these recognizable tunes speak to this universal language that we have between two cultures. I think the arts in Australia are also very well respected here, which is why our culture ministry has a relationship with the culture ministry in Australia to try to understand where this innovation and energy could possibly come from. And I think just the sheer courage and boldness of artists in general and musicians also in Australia is something that is very inspiring to see how the innovation and the thinking and the creativity translates into pushing the thought process of society forward. And for us, I think it's the hallmark of the arts in Australia.
Well, thank you, Huck. Li Wei, just to briefly return to you, I understand that you've performed at the Beijing Olympics and the London Olympics. Obviously, now we have the Tokyo Olympics underway. I was wondering if you could elaborate your experiences of performing at those Olympic Games and, the role between art and sport more broadly in reference to cultural diplomacy.
Oh, I have to make it clear that I still play the cello during these Olympics. Yeah, I wasn't running. I was the Beijing Olympics. I toured there. Was the Beijing Olympics? They had an arts festival attached to the Olympics. So there was Olympics Arts Festival, and I toured there as a soloist with the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, and it was very interesting because music and sports. We have many similarities. I think as a musician, the dedication, the motivation, and the ability, I suppose, to communicate with the listeners or people watching you doing sport or participating in sport. There's a lot of similarities. But I think for me, the most important thing is it actually breaks down the borders between countries. Because, for a football match to be taken place, whether it's in Africa or in China or in Australia, everybody knows the rules. Everybody knows how it goes. Same with music. I think that's probably the most important feature or essence of these both disciplines. And so when London Olympic came, and I was invited as a cellist together with Lan Lan. We were invited to play in the China Night at the London Olympics, and it was again, attended by ministers, and it was quite a political setting, but at the same time, because I think music broke ice. It actually opened up ideas and opened up possibilities without the borders. So I think music and sport has these very similarities. Yes.
Terrific. Thank you, Li Wei. Sophie, in May 2018, I had the privilege of interviewing MSO's chairman, Michael Ulmer, for a podcast I hosted. Michael was on a 6-city tour of China, and we caught up on the Shanghai leg of the tour to discuss the success of the tour, how popular classical music was among young people in China, and the rock star reception that the MSO receives on its tour of China. Clearly, 2018 was a different time in the Australia-China relationship. The Australia-China Free Trade Agreement had just been signed. Exports to China were booming. The AFL was playing regular games in China. The Australian Ballet and MSO were conducting regular tours. And I wanted to ask, during a time when the bilateral relationship is strained, how's the MSO maintaining its China ties for hopefully better days to come in the future once borders are reopened?
Well, we're forging ahead. We keep going. It is important for us to actually keep doing what we love most, doing music. So we have a collaboration agreement with the Shanghai Philharmonic, with the NCPA. We've already been talking to the Sichuan Opera with new projects. And I've been actually trying to deliver digital project with our colleagues in China. And we nearly got there this year. We were, just to tell you, we were performing a piece with a pipa player in Melbourne and going to do a recording of the MSO, the orchestra, and the pipa player, and have a performance of the MSO virtual performance in China to open a major festival with a pipa player on stage. Unfortunately, the weekend we were supposed to do that, we went into our third lockdown in Melbourne. So we had to abandon the project, but I've been working on other projects since that time. So thinking, if I look back, that tour in China, 2018, we had 6 sold out concerts. We had 9 diplomatic events, 15 business meetings that happened around our tour, lots of community engagement. So we're looking forward to going back to really engaging in person. But we hope it will happen at some point in the future. Meanwhile, we keep talking about commissioning, about exchange, about learning with masterclass like with Li Wei, and doing things that will keep us going, doing what we like most, doing music. And yes, that's it.
Well, let's hope some of the dreams can be realized in the not too distant future. Now we're about to start taking questions from the audience, but I just have one last question for the panel. Again, if the audience has any questions, please type those questions into the YouTube comment box. So to all of our speakers, we've been speaking about dealing with times during the pandemic, but hopefully not too short around the corner once borders do reopen. What's the first thing that your organisation is looking forward to once having the physical ability to travel and engage culturally with other nations overseas? Pippa Dixon, I might start with you.
Such a hard question, James, particularly after how excited I am with these new modes that we're working in. Pivoting back again to live and immersive, I'm looking forward to the sweat. I'm looking forward to being in warmer climes. Yeah, but I think, as I said earlier, the first connections with new communities is so vital. So that's what we're looking forward to. But just quickly, Li Wei, my primary residence is in Taroona in Lutruwita, Tasmania.
Oh, really?
I'd love to host you back there because I think you'll see it's changed a lot.
I'd love to go back to Taroona. Yeah, it's a little piece of me that always remember that, riding a bike down, Sandy Bay and go past Taroona, and Mum still had a place there. We never locked doors back then, 1989.
I digress.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks, James.
Huck, what about you? What are you looking forward to once borders reopen?
So personally, I think the first thing is a good cup of Melbourne coffee for myself. Organizationally, it's really been a while since we've toured, and we hope that we can have a chance for our orchestra or even individual musicians in the orchestra to travel internationally and make music together with people around the world. I think the pandemic, what it's really held back is the pheromones that people talk about of live interaction. And that is what we look forward to the most with live music as well.
Great. And Andrew, what about you? What's possible for DFAT once borders reopen with regards to cultural diplomacy?
Well, it's $1 million question for us because, inherent in our name is our job is to speak to people overseas, and it's a lot harder for us when you can't travel. It's a lot harder for our staffs in overseas mission, many of whom have not seen their extended family for many months, in some cases years. I think the short answer is to welcome the Australian artistic community back to overseas touring. We've all adjusted as best we can, but as everyone here knows, there's nothing better than the in-person concerts, both for the visceral effect that they have and the effect that live performances gives you, but also for the opportunity for that does for us to leverage that for other benefits for the Australia's national interests, Australia's image, and also for the benefit of the artists. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. I might turn to one of our audience questions. Sophie, this one's best for you. And this is from a viewer in Indonesia, how is the MSO continuing cultural diplomacy, especially in the special region of Yogyakarta in this pandemic era?
Oh, well, we have a wonderful question. We have a collaboration agreement with the special region of Yogyakarta, and we've been going to Yogyakarta and Jakarta on a yearly basis since I think 2016 or 2015. And we have been doing music workshop over there, working with amazing musician. And in last year, we started at the request of the Sultan and Governor of Yogyakarta to assist them in actually putting together a Yogyakarta Royal Orchestra. And so the whole year, we met every 2 weeks on Zoom to help them put together what is becoming the first symphony over there, which will be performing a mix of traditional music. They have the most amazing gamelan and traditional instruments, and also very, very talented young musician that we have been training for many years now. So that's to answer that question, that we've been very proud to see their first concert on 21st of June this year. And of course, looking at it on YouTube. And that reminds me that it's going to be fun to be able to travel again and see our many friends around the world, amazing musicians. Huck, I'm looking forward to sitting down with you, either in Melbourne or in Singapore, and with your amazing musician and ours, and saying, okay, we got there.
Here.
That's something we're all certainly looking forward to. Sophie, thank you very much. Maybe a question for Pippa. Pippa, how's it possible to quantify and qualify the impact of investment in art on a nation's soft power? And I think maybe an extension of that is, seeing the results of soft power with people-to-people connections in education, trade, business and sport.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are a lot of ways you can quantify and measure the impact of these relationships. There's often very short term, what the immediate impact has been for, say, the artists involved. I mentioned before, things like skills and capability development. What are they literally taking away? That often can be a bit more transactional. The longer term impacts take a long time to measure. You can measure shifts in perception of place, and Andrew referenced soft power index before and where Australia is currently sitting on it. So there are measures that we can look at to define what people's view of Australia's image, identity is through their projections. Obviously you can do surveys after the MSO's performed, or you can just have a look at this raging audience and the fan base as well to see what the impact is. But there are also economic outcomes as well, new business, new commissions, new tours that are measurable. But I think, a lot of it is developed over time. And so we might not be able to say, other than the transactional, what the deeper connections have been until sometimes 1, 2, 3, 5 or so years later. I will also say that, what I think is really interesting in Australia is, most of our cultural diplomacy activities are actually self-initiated. They're by individuals who are taking a leap of courage and faith to engage with our nearest neighbours. And, just a small percentage are funded by the Australian government and other state and territory governments. And I think we can often measure the increases with the government funding, but we can't always measure what's happening across the breadth and depth of artistic engagements. Actually, that's what really excites me, how we could best do that as a nation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Pippa. For our last question, Andrew, I might go to you. This is from our audience. To what extent is the use of cultural diplomacy relevant to state building?
Well, I guess, James, at the very outset, you used the phrase soft power, which I was grateful, because that can be a loaded term with some people. But what we see cultural diplomacy as soft power as, it's a core part of our diplomatic toolkit. And it is about, very frankly, it's about pursuing Australia's national interests, which we do across the sectors, but it improves Australia's image. It has a direct economic benefit, but it promotes an image. It promotes an image of Australia being democratic, diverse, contemporary, as I mentioned before. And look, I'll be very honest, when you're funding arts events, sometimes some of those events, they will say something that will sometimes be at odds with current government policy. That is the reality of artists. We are a democratic country. And Joe Biden actually said made a very interesting point when he was talking about how that America is going to acknowledge our problems, but we'll talk about them openly and we'll seek to address them. And that is what, in his view, makes America special. So this is not something that's unique to Australia, but the arts are a key part of that. The internal dialogue we have is part of what makes Australia the wonderful place to live that it is. So that projection of our internal debate, our internal culture, is something that it's part of our attractiveness as a country, and is why we rate highly on those soft power indexes. And it resonates with many people. It's not just people don't just like Australia for the Australian Open. I hope that answers the question. But I guess that if you were to ask our ambassadors overseas, they would see it as a core part of our diplomatic toolkit, of our tradecraft, and of building Australia's interests overseas. Thank you.
And just a quick follow-up from me on that, Andrew. With changes of government, does the intention of how Australia is perceived internationally change if governments change in Australia, or does it tend to be quite a static impression of how we like to portray ourselves overseas?
I think, I wouldn't want to language does evolve, but actually in most parts of foreign affairs, you'll actually see a fairly strong thread of bipartisanship. Going outside the cultural sector, for instance, the US alliance is the bedrock of both major parties in Australia's approach to overseas relations. I would say cultural diplomacy and the approach to soft power, it definitely evolves with different ministers and different priorities, but I think probably I wouldn't want to be an economist and put a percentage to it. I'm fighting my natural instincts, but I would say overwhelmingly it's something we consistently look at through both whatever governments in power. And to be perfectly honest, most ministers really enjoy us and engage. as I said, there are nuances and there are different priorities, but I would say the short answer is it's consistent and bipartisan, and it's something we're always looking to promote.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. That's very diplomatic of you. Well, sadly, that brings us to the end of tonight's event. Remember, you can see the MSO and SSO performance on YouTube this Friday, and Li Wei will be performing with the MSO all this week. So please check out the MSO website for all details on that. I'd like to thank our panel this evening, Chung Hak Peng, Pippa Dixon, Andrew Cumston, Li Wei Chin, and Sophie Galais. A huge thank you also to our Ears Wide Open presenting partner, Tarawara Estate, and to the City of Melbourne for their support of Ears Wide Open. Thank you also to the Australian Government through the Office of the Arts and the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations for their continued support of this event and our broader international engagement in general. To learn more about my organisation, the Asia Society Australia, a quick Google search of Asia Society Australia will take you to our homepage for all our upcoming events and activities. A big thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. And to see you out, here is another excerpt from that uplifting performance by MSO and SSO to end the evening. Good night.